So we'll get started. So for those of you who haven't been introduced to me, my name is James Tan. I've been working with Unreal Engine for about 13, 14 years now. Been a wee while. And today in this session, we're going to have a look at the Unreal Editor and sort of look at how you use the tools in Unreal Editor to start building your levels. So we've already done a lot of sessions today. So we looked at things like how to make a racer, how to make a platformer, how to do Kismet, and now we're actually going to get to the meat and bones of actually how you construct your levels. So just a really brief introduction to Unreal Editor. It's the main development toolkit within Unreal Engine 3. And you use it to create all your levels, including Kismet and Matinee. And you also use it to import all the content and organize and set up the content for your game. So, but yeah, we're going to go over the basics of how to create a level. So if UDK hasn't been started on your machine yet, just start up UDK. There's usually like a shortcut on the desktop. So we'll go from there. In your desktop as well, you'll have a folder called something like UU content or something along those lines. Inside that will be a zip file, which says something such as Introduction to Unreal Ed. If you double click on that, you'll see a folder inside all of those. You can actually unzip that into the root directory of UDK, and that has all of the maps as we're progressing forward. So in each of these slides, in each of these brackets, it'll sometimes say A, B, C, D. So basically, if I haven't explained things too well and you've sort of gotten a bit off track, you can actually just fast forward a wee bit. But otherwise, we'll progress forward. So we're going to talk about BSP. So BSP is an abbreviation for binary space partition. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a way of sorting out surfaces in a fast way. And what you're actually using is a set of primitives that perform mathematics to produce surfaces. And this is actually called constructive solid geometry, or CSG. And CSG can be used for blocking out levels and simple filler geometry. So say, for example, you get your artists and they make a whole bunch of pillar meshes and stuff like that, or they make a bunch of really cool floor tiles and stuff like that. And you sort of want to go, well, they've left some gaps in the meshes. You can use BSP to just fill up those little tiny gaps. Or if you're just starting out making your game, you can block out all of your levels just to sort of get an idea of what kind of space you need to provide the player for the kind of game you're making. So for example, if you're making sort of like a horror themed game, you want to go for like a really tight, sort of a tension kind of level, so you make areas cramped and small so that you limit the movement for your characters, for the player, and so that zombies that are walking around can have a decent chance of getting close to the player. But if you're making more like a arena game, like Unreal Tournament, then you might want really wide open spaces, so there's lots of areas for players to move around, shoot rockets at each other. So BSP is really, really fast. But in general, CSG is slower to render than static meshes. And it's just due to the way that they work. I won't go too much into technical details, but that's the reason why we're not using constructive solid geometry for everything in the world these days. It's just because it's just slower to render. So the thing about BSP, or in this case the proper name, CSG, is that you can add solid shapes to the world. So you can add a cube to the world, you can add a sphere, you can add a cylinder. You can also subtract solid shapes from the world. So think of it like a little bit like clay. You first add a block of clay, a cube of clay into the world, and then you can sort of subtract out cubes from the existing clay cube. And that's the best way to think about it. And based from the existing cubes of the surfaces that they generate, you can actually create more complex shapes from existing brushes in the world. We're gonna go slowly. So I'm just gonna explain it, and then we're gonna demonstrate it in Unreal Ed. So I'll just go back, and we'll start adding some shapes, and we'll demonstrate how to subtract solid shapes, and we'll also look at how to create more complex shapes. So Unreal Ed, so this red brush that you see is the builder's brush. So the builder's brush just gives you an idea of what you're going to add or subtract away from the world. One of the most common pitfalls that people have is that they resize or position the builder brush somewhere and then just sort of go, oh, okay, so now the brush is added for some magical reason. But you actually need to add what the builder brush is going to do into the world. And the way you do that is by using this function here, which is called CSG add. And that will add whatever that builder brush is doing into the world. So if I switch to the lit mode, so I'll just go to the perspective mode, and I can see, I can't really see it on the projector, but the builder's brush is here. So if I add that into the world, that's going to add a solid chunk to the world, like so. Ta-da, we have a nice little piece of geometry there. So if UDK has started up with like some default map, you can actually just press here and go, and it'll ask you which map template you can go for. Just go for a blank map, and you'll basically get nothing in the world. So, so we can move this builder's brush around. And you can add more stuff to the world. The other common pitfalls when people first start using Unreal Ed is that they're not too sure what these view modes do. Sometimes it may be in brush wireframe. So when you start adding brushes, you might actually see nothing happening. So if I click here, it looks like nothing's happened. But if I move the builder's brush, it's actually added a new brush there. But if you want to see brushes being added at real time, you want to switch to either the unlit mode or the lit mode. But we don't have any lights at the moment, so unlit mode is going to be the most useful to us. Okay, so we're going to go from there, and we're going to go at looking at subtracting solid shapes from the world. So I'm going to move my builder's brush somewhere, which will sort of eat away at the existing geometry. Sort of hard to tell what's going on in the perspective mode of where things are, so let's do that. So I'm going to actually take out a chunk from the existing geometry here. And you do that by using this CSG subtract key. And that's actually bound to Control S. So if you want to quickly save your map, don't press Control S, because it'll subtract a huge chunk from your world. There is actually no keybinds to save the level. So you often need to, but it does have, Unreal Ed is nice because it does have like an automatic backup solution as well. Anyway, you can click on that, and now we've subtracted a chunk from the world. And this is sort of how you create your world. You add some blocks to sort of block out the world, and then you can subtract away from the world to create, sort of playable rooms and stuff like that. But by no means do you actually have to create rooms. You can just have lots of little platforms floating in space, for example. Particularly if you really like that kind of arena game where you're jumping on jump pads in the middle of nowhere. You can sort of easily create those kinds of levels doing that. So, what do I mean by creating more complex shapes from existing brushes in the world? One of the things that you can do is that you get some basic primitives here, such as a cube, a cone, some stairs, and a cylinder, some more stairs, a sheet, some more stairs, and a sphere. Sometimes you actually might want to create like a half a cylinder. And so the question is, how do we go about doing that? So one really good example is I can create all of these brushes that I have here as a single brush. So I can go into the brush wireframe to show the wireframe for all the brushes. And I can just move it somewhere, move my builder's brush somewhere. And I can use these functions here, which is called CSG intersect, and the inverse of that, so CSG de-intersect. So when I click this option, the builder's brush is going to change itself according to what existing brushes it's overlapping. So if I click on that, you can see I've created a new brush, and it's based on what that builder's brush was overlapping. So that way, this is sort of how you create sort of more complex brushes if you want. So if you wanted to create sort of a semicircle, you could first build like a cylinder. You could then subtract half of that cylinder away, and then make a big builder's brush over it, and then do a CSG intersect, and it will create a new brush just like we've done here. If we do the inverse of that, it'll go the other way around. So if I click there, it's now gone the other way around. So I have this really weird brush where I have stuff sticking out of. And so if I add that and go to lit mode, you can sort of see what kind of brush it's created based on, it sort of looks like, as if you're making like puzzle pieces or something like that. So that's how you can create a little bit more complex CSG this way. But you ideally want to keep brushes as simple as possible all the time. If you can, keep them as cubes or spheres or whatever else. Try not to go too crazy with the de-intersect and intersect stuff. And also remember that these brushes, all they represent is mathematical instructions. Add a cube now, add a cube at step 0, add another cube at step 1, add another cube at step 3, subtract a cube at step number 4. And one of the things that people get stuck on is that they add a subtract somewhere, and then they re-add that brush later on, then add another subtract, and they wonder why it's not working the way that they think it is. And that's the reason, because of the order at which they added these brushes. However, you can actually change the order at which these brushes were added. So for example, I can set this, so in the order that I added these brushes, see I added this one, then I added this one, then I added this one, and then I subtracted this one here, and that produces this inner shape here. But what I can do is change the order of when this brush gets added by right-clicking on that brush and going to order, and I can make it last, so as if I've added that add brush last. So when that happens, nothing changes at first, so you actually need to rebuild the geometry when you've changed the order of the brushes. So if I rebuild now, see, because I've added this brush last, it comes after that subtract equation. It comes after that subtract brush. And so I've changed the order of the equation. And so sometimes if you notice, if your subtract brush is not subtracting away from the world like it used to, it's probably likely to be the order. At some point later in time, you've added another brush on top of that subtract brush. So the subtract ends up doing nothing. And always remember that there is a brush view mode. So if you can't, in this view mode here, where all the surfaces are unlit, I can't actually select those brushes except the builder's brush. So people, one of the common problems that people run into is that they select a surface and they want to delete that brush, and so they'll press the delete button and nothing happens. And so they jump on the forums and they go, so how do I delete a brush? You actually do this using the brush view mode. So you go to the brush view mode, you select the brush that you want to delete, you press the delete button, and because you've changed the instructions of the world geometry, you then have to rebuild, and then that brush is now gone. So that's actually how you delete brushes. You go into the brush view mode, and then you delete the brushes that you no longer want. So, so what are view modes? So view modes change how you see the world, and it's done so that you can see the world in different ways to make it easier for you to modify the world. So in this case, I'm seeing the world just as brushes. I'm seeing the wireframes that the brushes have created, and that gives me a good idea of how many polygons the BSP is creating, or the CSG is creating. This shows the world is unlit. So if your levels are quite moody and dark, and you want to be able to add some pipes and stuff, but you sort of need to be able to see what's happening, you can turn off all the lights and shadows in that method. We've got no lights So I'm just going to quickly add a light to demonstrate these other view modes. So here we've got a light, and now we've switched to lit mode. You can sort of get a good idea of how the world is going to be lit, where the shadows are casting from, and it's all nice and real time, so you get a good idea of what's happening. You can also switch to a detail lighting mode, and this switches to lighting only in a grayscale, so that you can estimate what exactly your light is doing, and plus it uses all the normal map information as well, which is really nice. You can also switch to just the lighting mode with no normal maps being applied. And then you've got other options here which are more for profiling. So you can sort of see what my lighting complexity is. So the lighting complexity in this scene is pretty simplistic because we've got one light at the moment. But if we have lots of different lights, you can start to see, oh, okay, those areas are getting more complex. And that helps you profile exactly what's happening in your game. And then you can also go to texture density. You can also go to shader complexity, and you can also go to light map density. So the light map density feature is actually really handy for later on. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we approach the lighting section. Okay. Okay, so before I continue on to static meshes, did anybody have any questions at all about BSP or CSG at all? Yep, you might need to go up to the microphone.
I was just wondering, once you open the builder brush,
yeah.
Is there any way to reset the actual brush to the original after you've altered the, like, what's actually happening to it, like the size or anything like that?
Yep, okay. So one of the things that I glossed over, or I actually didn't mention at all, is that you can always push these buttons again, because right now my builder's brush is this shape here. I can always just repress that, and that'll reset the builder's brush back to its a normal form again. Another thing that I also didn't mention is that you can actually right-click these buttons as well, and that brings up a properties window, and here you can adjust the properties to do different things. So that increases the width and so on. But once you've changed these, you can also reset them by right-clicking and reset them back to defaults as well. Cool. All right, well, we're going to jump ahead and move on to static meshes, because this is the fun part of level design, is that you get to take all the cool content that people have created in 3ds Max or Maya and put them into the level. And static meshes generally use light maps to bake in the pre-computated lighting. And this basically makes them really fast for rendering, and also makes them really fast when they're being shadowed and lit and stuff like that. So we're going to go to our content browser. And the technical reason why they're really fast to render is because in the engine, it uploads all the vertices and polygons to the video memory once. And no matter how many times you use them in the map, it only sits in memory once. And basically, Unreal just tells the video card, render this mesh like 50 times with these different scalings and different location and rotations. And that's all it's doing. So it's really, really fast to render them. So to add static meshes, got one more point here. So static meshes, if you were here in the previous session, Frank sort of mentioned that static meshes generally don't move, they don't animate and stuff like that. That's why they're called static meshes. You can actually use materials to perform vertex animation on them. So for example, you might have a static mesh, which is like this cool banner here, and you might want to add like a really subtle ripple effect. You can actually do that by using either physics to animate the cloth, or you can use a cheaper method, which is just to move the vertexes using the vertex shader options in the material editor. But let's place some static meshes in the world. So we do this by opening up the content browser. We're going to turn on the filter so that we don't see everything, but we just want to look for static meshes. So I click on the static meshes filter, and I need to find some static meshes. So the content browser is now only going to show me some static meshes. So I might add some concrete stuff. Okay, that's nice. So You can do this in two ways. You can select the static mesh in the content browser. You can then right-click and add static mesh. Now the content browser is really, really efficient. It only ever loads what it absolutely needs to. So what you end up having is these little, this little symbol here. And what that means is that it hasn't been loaded into memory yet. So if you want to use this static mesh in the level editor, you need to usually load them. And you do that just by right-clicking on them. And then that symbol disappears, and you've now loaded the mesh into memory. So it's nice and easy. So you can left-click, you can then right-click, add static mesh. And it adds it to where the mouse intersects with the world geometry. And that's a really nice feature. You can also just drag and drop as well. That's also really nice. So if I just, so I left click, drag, and I just leave the mouse where I want it to go. So just drag and drop into a different location. And the nice thing about using static meshes as well is that you don't need to, if you move them around or if you delete them, you don't need to rebuild geometry each and every time. So I'll just add a few more static meshes. Like so. Okay. So static meshes is one way to start adding more detail to your levels. And they often add a significant bulk of the polygons to any scene. So you can use them for like all the grass in a scene. You can use them for all the little rocks. You can use them for all the pillars. Basically, anything that is decorative in the world would probably be a static mesh, unless it needs to, unless it has a specific animation that you want to play. So say, for example, in a game where you have like a tree which can sort of wave its branches or something like that, then that might want to be a skeletal mesh or something like that. But most of everything else will be a static mesh. So another way we can start adding some more detail into your maps is by using decals. So if you imagine decals as sort of like graffiti. You sort of walk up to a wall and you have like a mask. You know, you sort of have like a cardboard cutout and you start spray painting. That's sort of what decals are doing. So we're going to find some decals, and we do this by going to the content browser, and we're going to filter for decal materials. Now, normally with your filter options, you have a set of favorites, or these are the default favorites, but you can always click on this tab to bring up all different types of content that you want to see. And from here, we can select decal materials. So this will just show us materials which are designed to be used with the decal system. So by selecting a decal, I've got symbols on here saying that they're not loaded yet, so I'm going to right-click them to load them. Once I've selected them, I can then drag and drop if I want to, and then I can start splatting some decals all over the place. So decals work on pretty much every surface. So as you can see, it's working on the static meshes. So I'll add some more, and it adds some really interesting things to the environment. We can start adding a lot more detail and stuff like that. And this is generally how you do things like maybe burn marks in walls, or if you wanted to give areas a little bit more detail with things like graffiti or scratch marks or things like that. So I guess think of it as a way to allow your artists to quickly add lots of detail, really subtle and really small detail. So, if you're, say, making a combat zone, and your artists can go in and start putting lots of decals which represent things like bullet holes or something like that. And they can do this all over the place. So decals are best used for things such as radioactive goo, which I've done here. It's good for paint, like graffiti, or it's good for things like blood splatter. And decals are generally pretty fast, but they do increase pixel overdraw. As you can see here, decals are just a square projecting outwards. And in the areas where the material says, oh, there's nothing here, it's actually using an opacity map to do that. Opacity maps can get a little bit expensive, and one way to get around it is by using masked materials, which are either there is something to draw here or there's nothing to draw here. So if you find that if you're using lots of decals everywhere and your performance is not as good as you want it to be, you can switch those decals to mask materials, and then they're a lot faster. So anybody got any questions about static meshes or decals before I move on to lighting and shadows? Nope, okay. So let's move on to lighting and shadows. So basically lighting is added into the world via directional lights, point lights, spotlights, and skylights. So let's experiment with all of them. So when you first add all of these lights into the world, they're all dynamic to start with. And once you cook the world as such, it performs all the light mass. And what light mass is that it's an offline rendering method to sort of calculate all the global illumination for all the level. And this does all the bounce lighting for us, so we don't need to manually create that. And in general, it's really, really nice. So we can start by adding some lights into the world. And we do this by simply right-clicking where we want to add a light. And you go Add Actor. And you can add a light, and this is just a point light. So once we do that, if Unreal Editor hasn't shifted you to the lit mode, you can switch to the lit mode by going up here. And that will give you a good idea of what this light is doing. So as you move it around, you sort of see where the shadows are likely to be casted. Yep. Now, so how do we add the other lights? One way of doing it is to simply add a point light, like we've done here, and then you can right-click on the light itself. You can convert the light, and you can convert it into any one of the 4 options, such as the spotlight, the directional light, or the skylight. So when is a good time to use one of these 4 options? So point lights are basically lights that exist somewhere in world space, and they emit light in every single direction. So think of it as sort of like a bulb attached to like the end of a cable, and it just sort of emit light everywhere. So they're really useful if you sort of want to generally light an area. You don't really care about where the light's coming from. It's just sort of like there is light somewhere in here. Spotlights are best used for things such as lights that have a specific cone. So spotlights would represent like these kinds of lights. They're pointing at me right now. They're not casting any light behind them. They're just casting light in front of them inside that cone. So as I move that across, you can see it's just inside that cone. So another kind of light you have is the directional light. So directional light basically casts light from the entire level in a single parallel direction. So there's no source point for this light, and this kind of light is best used to represent lights that come from like a really far away distance, and that would be for things like the sun, for example. So rather than having millions of spotlights everywhere, you can have one directional light like this, and it basically casts light infinitely everywhere in the direction that you provide it. So as you can see, as I move the light upwards, it's casting from underneath, as I move it that way, and so on. So this is a really quick and easy way to add, say, a sunlight to your entire level. The last light that you've got available to you is skylights. And we can do that also by converting the light. Skylight. And basically this just casts light everywhere. So if the level is too dark, or you find that the shadows in the game are generally too dark, by adding a skylight, it just says this whole area, this entire level has now been brightened up. So it's as if somebody's just turned up the brightness everywhere. And all of these lights can have colors, obviously. And the way you access that is by going into the light properties. You can do this by either double-clicking the icon or by pressing F4 on the selected. If you have a light selected, you can then just press F4. So it depends whether you're more keyboard-orientated or mouse-orientated. You can do that or just double-click them. And when you expand the categories, the light category, and you have the light component, you have a light color field, and you can set that to whatever color you want. So I might make it a purple color, for example. And you can adjust the brightness as well. So if I set that to 3 or 6 or whatever, it becomes brighter or weaker. Okay. So the important thing to realize and also to know is that mask, textures, and translucent materials also cast shadows correctly. So for example, if you have a texture, if you have a material that has like holes in it, it will still cast shadows through that correctly. I'll see if I can find a static mesh that has sort of holes in it. There is that sphere of doom. So I will add that. So as you can see, I've got my light here, and in the light's preview mode, it's casting shadows correctly. Once I bake the lighting, it should cast it through as well. And we can also tweak the light mask settings to change how the lighting, how long it takes to calculate the lighting. One of the things that a lot of people sort of comment on is that light mask takes forever on their machines. This is directly proportional to, of course, the machine's actual strength in terms of like how fast the CPU is, how much memory they have. But you can actually tweak settings to adjust how long light mask takes. And that's basically, if you right click this menu here, you can go from preview, medium, high, or production. And switching between these modes switches between the different quality modes that light mask produces. You can actually also turn off light mask if you don't want it by going into view, world properties, going down to light mask, and you can, if you uncheck this, this will no longer use light mask and will use the traditional light mapping methods that was available back in Unreal Engine 1 and 2. So I'm going to turn that off, and I'm actually going to light this world now, because right now we have just dynamic lighting. It hasn't produced all the static shadows and whatnot. So I am going to click this button here, which is build all. So that's going to build all the geometry, and it's going to make sure that all the BSP is up to date, and that's also going to perform the lighting. So down here, I've just got a dialog box which says, it's importing all the lighting and so on. So I'm using the traditional lighting method. As you can see, it's not as accurate as the light mask method, but it gives me a good idea. Sort of gives me a good preview of what's happening with all the lights and how the static shadows are going to be casted. And also, it allows me to do really quick iterations as well. So that was a really quick overview and a really quick glossing over how lights and shadows work inside Unreal Ed. Does anybody have any questions about that? Nope. Okay. All right, so the next thing we can add is particle effects, which add a lot of dynamic detail to your level. So particle effects are often animating, they're often moving, they're often, they're really good for things like fire, and it's bright, and it's giving off smoke and stuff like that. Or maybe you have a tree in your level and you want to make leaves fall down and sort of drift down. Or if you wanted to do some other effects in your game, such as rain or snow. All of these are really neat effects that you can add to just sort of help the player to immerse themselves in the environment. So the way we add them is by going to the content browser, and we're going to filter for particle systems because we're not interested in everything else. So any sort of particle that you find interesting, you can just sort of drag and drop into your level. So it looks like we've got some leaves here. So I've just dragged and dropped some leaves. And one of the important things about Unreal Editor is that it doesn't assume that you want to see everything in real time. Because sometimes, depending on the power of your PC, seeing everything in real time is going to cause some real slow and cause some real serious problems. If your PC is slow, then it's going to be slow, right? So sometimes you may want to turn real time on to see what particles are doing. And you do this by clicking on this joystick here. And then we'll start to see particles animate to sort of see what that effect is going to be like. So some particles have a direction. So this looks like it's throwing out leaves in sort of that arrow direction. So we can rotate it down and so on so that the leaves come out in the proper direction. And I can add more particle effects. And that's, with real-time mode on, it gives you a really good idea of what those particle effects are doing, and also how they're behaving in the world as well. Just see if I can find something that looks like fire. Yeah, okay, so I have something really interesting. So I have my sphere here, which is on fire, and I have some leaves falling down. So particle effects really help to just sort of liven up the scene. So particle effects can collide and interact with the world if they have been properly set up in Cascade. We probably won't go in this today, but just sort of as a footnote that you can sort of keep and experiment with later on down the line. So the next thing we can do is, after we've added lights and we've added some BSP and added some static meshes and some particle effects, is that you want to start adding some sounds to the world so that the world sounds interesting, so that people get an idea of what's going on, where they are, what's sort of happening around them. So we do this by, once again, going to our content browser and sort of finding what sort of sounds sound good. So in this case, you know, I've got some leaves falling down and I've got a fire here. So ideally what I want to do is add some sounds which sort of have like a wind, sort of a sound effect, and something that sounds like fire. So the nice thing about Unreal Editor is that you can play back these sounds. So you're not dependent on sort of guessing by the names of files. So I'm just going to close that, open up sounds, go to ambient loops, and turn that off. So we can sort of play these sounds back and sort of figure out, you know, do they achieve the sound that we're looking for? Yeah, so maybe that sound will do. So what you can do is you can, once again, you can just select, drag and drop, and it'll automatically create for you this little sound blaster icon. And that means that there's some sound going to be playing back within that general area of that sound blaster icon. Now, Unreal Editor doesn't assume that you always want to hear these sounds, because I imagine if you hear these sounds all the time while you're editing your level, it's going to be a little annoying. So Unreal Editor provides this really handy option of being able to toggle real-time audio or not, and usually have it up here in this little speaker here. So if I turn it on, I can hear the sounds, and as I move away, I don't hear those sounds so much. And that gives you a good idea as you're flying through the level as to what sort of sounds you're getting as you're walking through the level as well, as you move around it. Which is really, really nice. All right, so we're going to move on and add a fire sound effect as well. That doesn't sound like fire. Neither does that. Ah. Yeah, so that sounds a lot better. So we're going to drag and drop this into the scene as well, because we have a fire particle effect here. And we're going to just position that so it's somewhat near the fire particles. And now, if we turn on that, you sort of get this combination of this wind sound being played back and the fire sound being played back, and they're mixing nicely. And so you get this really nice, you sort of get an idea of what kind of environment that we're trying to build. I'm going to pause that. Well, sorry, I'm just going to turn off the sounds. So you can actually overlay as many of these ambient sounds as you like, and all of that can sort of start to build up to give a really good description to the player about what kind of environment they're in. Depending on the positioning of these sound blasters, you can make it so that the birds sort of chirping away in this environment are really high above. So as the player gets higher and higher up in his scene, or in the level, the birds become louder, and that sort of gives a good indication at what height the player is at. So yeah. You can also add reverb volumes as well, which sort of perform like an echo feedback, and we're going to look into volumes next. So before we proceed forwards into volumes, does anybody have any questions about particle effects or ambient sounds? Yep, if you can just sort of go to the microphone, that way everyone can hear.
How do you change the range of the sound?
How do you change the range of the sound? Okay. So the range of the sound is controlled by this actor here. And as you can see, you've got these blue radius circles, right? So just like the lights, you can press F4. And you get, as you pull down these properties, you can sort of see at what sort of radius that you can hear these sounds at. So I'm just going to turn this back on so I can hear the sound still. So if I decrease the radius for that, so I'm not hearing that sound anymore. So these blue circles have changed, right? Or the spheres have changed. So as I get towards those and the camera is starting to get inside those, I can start hearing the sound again. So yeah, that's how you do that. And you've got lots of other options as well. So for example, you can put it through like a low pass filter, which also helps with attenuation as well. You can also adjust its pitch, min and max, for example. You can change that down to 0.9, 1.1. So as the sound loops, it loops back at slightly different pitches, so that way the looping is not so noticeable. You can also adjust its minimum and maximum volumes as well. So we can set to 0.2 and 0.4, or 0.4. And that way, as the sound is being looped, it's being looped at slightly different volumes, slightly different pitches. And with that randomization, it just feels like that fire is sort of, going into life and going slightly back out and going in and so on like that. So yeah. So basically, when you place down actors like this, whether it's a particle effect or a light, they usually have some kind of properties that you can adjust. And you do that by pressing F4 or double clicking on the icon in the wheeled viewport, and you can mess around and play with those options. Yeah, no problems. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is volumes. So volumes are invisible brushes that define an area for localized effects. So these localized effects can be like blocking. They can perform triggers, so you have trigger volumes. They can be volumes which represent areas such as water or lava or slime. They can also be areas which say that when a player enters into this area, we should turn on the different post-processing effect. So for example, you may have like a player inside a really dark cave to begin with, and what you want to do in that post-processing is have it to colorize it so it's a little bit dark. You can turn on some film grain, because that's usually what happens when you're sort of in a dark sort of a cave. But as he gets out of that cave, you can have another post-processing volume which says, okay, now amp up the brightness to simulate players, their eyes are adjusting to the brightness and stuff like that. So you can do lots of really neat effects like that. So how do we add volumes? So volumes are brushes, basically. So if we go back to our builder brush, by pressing that, if you ever lose your builders brush, it's actually you can actually find it by, the resolution is not enough on this monitor, but there's actually an option down here which allows you to press it and it will zoom to your builder's brush. But anyway, my builder's brush is up here. So we're going to add a post-processing effect because that's usually the most visible thing you can do. So I'm going to make the builder's brush really large, so we have a large volume. So I do that by right-clicking. And we set it to something huge, like 2048 by 2048. Okay, so basically everything inside this builder's brush is going to change its post-processing. So the way we add volumes is we right-click on this sort of a blue cube icon down here. And once you right-click, you get presented with a bunch of options. So as you can see, we have blocking volumes, we have cull distance volumes. So basically, if you're far away enough from this volume, it just culls everything out inside that volume. We have things like dynamic triggers and dynamic physics and gravity and ladders and so on. So we're going to add a post-processing volume, like so. So we've added a post-processing volume. And if you move away, you'll see that it's added this wireframe volume. It's added this wireframe brush that you can always see. But it doesn't contribute at all to the geometry in the level. And that's what you want. So from there, you can double-click the post-processing volume, like you would with any actor, or you can select it and then press F4. And then you can adjust its properties to override the post-processing that happens. So I'm going to turn on depth of field, because I always like that effect. And as you can see, while I'm inside this volume, I have this depth of field effect. But as soon as I move the camera outside this volume, it turns off again because that volume is no longer affecting the post-processing. So I'm outside, I'm now back inside. So this provides a really nice localized system of where you can say this area should be really bright and we have some depth of field, or we have some higher bloom because there's more lights in the scene. But when the character moves inside a building, you may want to tone down the colorizing for the post-processing effects. You may want to turn off depth of field so that people have perfect clarity of vision when they're inside a building. It's sort of a really nice way so that as you move around the map, you can simulate different environments. And I'll show you an example of that that's done inside UDK after we go through this last slide here. So blocking volumes add invisible walls to the level. And it's often advisable to simplify your level collision as much as possible by using blocking volumes. And this is because it's really, really frustrating to be walking around in a level and to have you collide with like a little pipe that's on the floor. It might be realistic to collide with that little tiny pipe, but it's really not that fun. So, and yeah, and as we've seen, post-processing volumes can alter the current post-processing filter, as we've done here, when the player is inside them. Now, the other neat trick that we can tie back to the BSP is that when you're using BSP to block out your level, you're creating the playable space, right? After you've actually done all that, and after you've tested, like let's say this was a finished level, and after you've finished doing all of that, as long as you've used mostly additive brushes, you can actually just click on them, and so by selecting all of the additive brushes, you can actually then just right-click all your additive brushes, and you can actually just, where is it? You can actually just convert all of your additive brushes to blocking volumes. And the neat thing about that is that you can block out your entire playable area. So say you have like floors and walls and pillars and stuff, and you know that that area works really well for the game that you're going for. You can just convert all of that to blocking volumes, so it removes all the geometry from the scene, but you still have that same collision data that you had while you were testing that level during production, during development. And that way, you can tell all of your artists, as they're putting down static meshes and things, to just say, okay, put your meshes inside those blocking volumes. because then as they're making the levels look really cool, they're not making the areas smaller and smaller because they're basically inside those blocking volumes. It makes sure that the playable space stays exactly the same. And that's a really nice, simple workflow as well that you can use. Okay, so we're near the end of the presentation, so we'll just go through some of the help that you can get online if you're not aware of them. So Epic Games Forums has a subforum that's dedicated to Unreal Development Kit. There are lots of veterans on the forums that try to do their best to help everybody out. So I'm on there a couple of times a day trying to answer questions and so forth. And the site is forums.epicgames.com. And there's also the UDN, or the Unreal Developers Network. That's dedicated to the documentation of the UDK. And it's always being updated. Lots of new reference materials and tutorials. Sorry, lots of new reference materials and tutorials being added each month. And that's udn.epicgames.com. So I'm going to boot up DMDeck, and you'll sort of see how these basic principles form up the level. And as you keep working away at it, you always get to build something really neat. So if we look at the level in just unlit mode, you can sort of see the basics here. Like you've just got lots and lots of static meshes all over the place. And by using the static meshes in a nice modular way, you can stack pillars on top of each other, you can angle them, things like that. And that sort of helps to create the scenery. They still do have some BSP in here. But if I remove, or if I take away the static meshes from view, you can sort of see how little BSP is actually used in DMDeck. So DMDeck uses very little BSP, and what they would have done is just sort of blocked out the level in general. So they would have placed the ramps there, placed some of the floors and some of the walls. And as you can see, some of the existing BSP was actually converted back into blocking volumes. And then because they're now blocking volumes, they're invisible, they redecorate that area with static meshes, like so. And just referencing back to the post-processing volume, I'm just going to start the game, and you can sort of see what I mean. Got all the scaffolding stuff still installed. So while the player's in this sort of area, it's been rolling down. So while the player's in this area, it's got slightly different post-processing effect in it, but if he goes outside, it sort of changes into a slightly blue tint, and there's more bloom as well. It's a really subtle change, but it sort of helps to emphasize you're now outside sort of thing. And if we jump down into the pits, into the slime, we sort of get a different post-processing again. It's now blurry, and it's green, and sort of green goo, and I'm losing health, and stuff like that. So that's some of the nice things that you can do with post-process volumes. All right, looks like we've got a couple of minutes left for questions. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming along and listening to the last session of the day. Hopefully you've got some good information out of this session. So if anyone's got any questions, just feel free to walk up to the microphones and I'll do my best to answer them. Unless a question could be to elaborate further on something as well. Okay. One thing I actually forgot to mention was actually all the tools that you have available in terms of like how do you move brushes around, how do you rotate them and stuff like that. So as you're developing levels, okay. All right, so we've got the builds brush here. So you may want to say, okay, so how do I modify the size of this brush without having to go into that, into this sort of property window here? You can do that by actually using these tools up here. So this is just a selection mode. So if all you're doing is modifying the properties of actors, you don't want to accidentally select them and then move them somewhere else. So you switch to this mode, and all that mode does is that you can only select things. You can press spacebar, or you can actually press it on the toolbar. So by pressing spacebar, you toggle through the different modes. So pressing spacebar, and that shifts me to the translation mode. I can then sort of move stuff around. So it's very similar to most content creation packages. I can press spacebar again, that switches to a rotation mode. And I can press spacebar again, and that shifts me to a uniform scaling mode. Or I can shift one more to a non-uniform scaling mode, where I can do that. And these tools work on the majority of actors. So interp actors, you can scale them, you can rotate them, you can move them. Static mesh actors, you can do the same thing. Skeletal mesh actors, and so on and so on. So that's kind of neat. One more thing I'll mention as well while we're here is I'll mention the static mesh mode. And this allows you to quickly place down static meshes in sort of a random sort of way. And we tend to use this method. This method was used a lot before foliage came in, because if you want to put down lots of grass everywhere, it's kind of annoying having to drag and drop things everywhere and then having to rotate them slightly and scale them slightly. So the one way we do this is by finding the static mesh that we want first. So I guess we've got some good ones in here. So we're going to use a clump of grass, if I can find it. Here we go. So now that we've got that selected, we can switch to static mesh mode, and you do that by clicking on this, and that brings you up a properties panel. And you can set some options here. So we can set these all of these static meshes to have no collision, because we're going to do grass so players can walk through them. We're going to have some rotation minimum values on them, so maybe we'll have that the pitch is say -10, and we'll have that as -180. And we'll also do a maximum rotation, so we'll have that as 10, and we'll have that as 180. And we might just do some scale minimum and maximums. So maybe we'll say 0.2, and we'll set that at 0.8. And when you hold down the S key, while this mode is still active, you can actually just plonk down a whole bunch of random static meshes which follow these rules here. Someone's turned on WASD for the mouse movement. The very top, flight controls, yeah, thanks. So I never used, what's that? So as I hold down S, you can sort of see that they're being plonked down at different sizes and different rotations. And this really allows you to quickly place down static meshes into areas that you want to populate real quickly. So the other obvious problem is that what happens when you have like this, they're just being put down, but they're not being aligned to the surface. If you press Alt-S and then press that, it actually aligns it to the surface of the polygon that you're touching. And that's really nice if you're wanting to decorate stuff like a car and you want to put like flowers and grass all over it. If you press Alt-S and then you left click, that'll help to put the mesh aligned to that surface, which is a really handy tool. But nowadays we have the foliage tool, which allows you to quickly paint meshes all over the place. Yeah. That way everybody can sort of hear the question and stuff.
Does this actually work?
Yeah.
I was wondering if it could go on like rounded surfaces too.
Yep.
Does it actually?
It sure does. So say, for example, I'll make one of these meshes like really huge. Right. So if I press Alt-S on these edges, on the grass blades, they should conform to the surface. Actually, I might use a cube because it'd be much easier to see that effect. So I'll just switch to engine. cube. So I'll just go back to my static mesh mode, and I'll just set those to 0. These are not colliding, that's why. Right, that's colliding. Collision. Right, so here's a reasonably nice curve. So you can see it's sort of aligning itself even to the curvature of that grass blade, which is kind of nice. Yeah. All right, guys, thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your night.